Já, komið þið sæl. Við ætlum að hafa þennan viðburð á ensku í dag. Welcome everyone to the special recorded session of the PhD Student Toolbox, which will be made available on the graduate school website in due course. My name is Toby Wikstrom from the graduate school, and I'm the moderator for today's talk. So the graduate school and the School of Education here at the University of Iceland are very honored to welcome Professor Stephen Billett to our campus for a series of talks this month. Dr. Billett comes to us all the way from Griffith University in Brisbane, Australia, where he is Professor of Adult and Vocational Education in the School of Education and Professional Studies. Professor Billett has a really interesting background. He started off with a career in garment manufacturing and then started working as a vocational educator, an educational administrator, teacher educator, a professional development practitioner and policy developer in the domain of Australian vocational education, and then began an academic career as a teacher and researcher at Griffith University in Brisbane. And since 1992, he's researched learning through and for work and has published widely in the fields of learning of occupations, workplace learning, and work and conceptual accounts of learning for vocational purposes. And along the way, he's really accumulated some tremendous honors, which I'll just list very briefly. He's been a Fulbright Scholar, a National Teaching Fellow, an Australian Research Council Future Fellow. He's been awarded one honorary degree doctorates by Jyväskylä University in Finland and the University of Geneva. He was also elected Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences of Australia. He has an honorary lifetime membership of the Australian Cooperative Education Network, and he's also an honorary research fellow at Oxford University. Plus, he holds adjunct appointments at the University of Stavanger and University West in Sweden, and he currently leads research projects in Australia, Singapore, and Finland, which are funded by national granting bodies there. The Stanford World Ranking of Scientists places him in the top 1% of researchers in the field of education, and he's actually ranked 38th out of over 58,000 researchers, and his Scopus indicates that he has an H-index of 46. All this to say that we're really fortunate to have Professor Billett with us today. His talk today is titled Building Publication Profiles for Academic Success, a dialogue forum. And this, like some of his other work, is about workplace education, in this case for PhD students and early career researchers. And after his talk, I'll ask Professor Billett some questions that might be useful for that group of early career researchers. So Professor Billett, thank you so much for sharing your expertise, for coming from the other side of the world to be with us. Over to you.
Well, thanks, Toby, and thanks for that warm introduction. And also, I like the point you made, which is about focusing on the work of PhD students and doing academics and academics generally. So the topic is the building a publication profile for academic success. So many of us are involved in a range of activities that get us to look at and understand what constitutes a likely successful process, academic process or life. For instance, many of us are involved in interviewing or reviewing for academic jobs, assessing tenure and promotion applications. We're also involved in preparing and reviewing grant applications and preparing and reviewing publications, and also assessing awards for fellowship schemes, etc., etc. So many people in the academic field are involved in these tasks. And I guess if you were to ask people who've been involved in those tasks, they would probably suggest that the following are important. And that is, when we look at the various stepping stones, the various stages along an academic career, there's a bit of a pattern emerges. So if we take, for instance, each of these stages, three key qualities that are important, for instance, for securing a job, there is the potential for research publications, performance and teaching, and also the focus of the activities of the researcher, the individual. Then in terms of tenure or promotion, it'll be, again, teaching performance, but also research and publications and service. Then if you're trying to secure funds for research activities, getting grants, which is a big part of many academics' work, the quality of the application is important, its focus and alignment with the scheme is important, but it's often underpinned by a publication track record. And then publications themselves, that there is the quantum of the publications, the number that people have, but also importantly, the quality, the focus of them, and very importantly, the number of citations which those publications have generated. And then in terms of awards and fellowships, it's often the contributions an individual has made, the focus of their work aligned with a particular award scheme, but inevitably the track record of publication comes out to play. So the key point and the obvious point here is that when we look across all of these steps or considerations or elements of a successful academic career, we see a pattern. And so the proposal here is that developing a strong publication profile is central to many aspects of academic success. It is required to secure an academic position, tenure, promotion, securing research funds, and increasingly competitive rounds, invitation to scientific collaborations and publications, special issues, being invited to produce book chapters, to contribute to encyclopedias, and then plenaries, keynotes, and then getting prestigious scholarships. Now, I can fully understand that some people would say, well, it shouldn't just be based on publications, and that's true. And you'll see from the previous slide, there's a range of factors that sit around the various pathways to success, but consistent amongst that and a way of indicating your work, your contributions, is through the kind and quality of publications that an individual has developed, often in conjunction with others. Such profiles, to be competitive, need to have coherence, and as I've mentioned, focus on the quality and quantity of the research that's peer-reviewed, that is, others have engaged with it and judged it, your peers have engaged with it and judged it to be worthwhile and warranting publication, and that then obviously leads to other outcomes, such as being invited to contribute to book chapters and special issues and give plenaries and keynotes, etc. So building these profiles is important, yet it can be challenging and effortful. I mean, that's the obvious thing, that this doesn't come easy. And it's often driven by academic sense of vocation or their ambition. And let's be open about that. In terms of vocation, I mean, many academics are driven by a particular interest in a particular field. I've been driven in my work from the experiences I had as a young man of trying to negotiate the transition from a tertiary education into working life and finding that very difficult. And then that has led me then to pursue the kind of work that I do now. Others are driven by, ambition to achieve and to be recognized for their achievement. And I guess that's fine. But the point is that there needs to be some intentionality, some motives behind the efforts leading to a strong publication profile. And there's a particular challenge which I think is important for you in Iceland, as it is indeed for other countries such as Australia. And that is a challenge faced by academics outside of principal publishing countries. And that is to overcome the kind of cultural bias that exists, that material that comes from those countries is inherently good and worthwhile, and yet material coming from outside of those countries is often subject to unreasonable and unhelpful scrutiny and criticism that wouldn't be applied to material coming from those principal countries. So I want to refer to that in this presentation. So the aim here is to discuss these issues through a dialogue. I'm afraid this is going to be a bit of a monologue, and to consider and share experiences that provide goals for you as participants and potential strategies for building a strong research publication. Now, I do so on a number of bases. Firstly, that I'm the editor of a journal, a founding editor of the journal, I should add. And also I'm the editor of a book series, an editor of an encyclopedia. In addition, I sit on various granting committees on the Australian Research Council, making judgments about grants. I'm also currently in the Belgium National Granting Committee, and I review applications for a number of countries elsewhere. So I bring to this, and I'm also, I should say, a member of the membership committee, which makes judgments about who becomes fellows of the Academy of the Australian Social Sciences. So I bring these perspectives to this activity, as well as being somebody who publishes and reviews a lot of material. So in terms of then from these insights, so what constitutes a strong publication profile? Well, it's probably something as follows. That firstly, it's coherence, that there is a consistent line of topics that a person's engaged with and demonstrates over a period of time greater depth and contributions to those fields. And so that's different than people doing ad hoc work, which doesn't cohere, doesn't come together. That's not to say that there's just has to be one line, but the lines of inquiry, the lines of scholarship should in some way be coherent and consonant in some way, that they speak to each other and they represent a significant and coherent body of work. And that consistency of having a regular pattern of publications, of indicating that this is what your commitment is to the field, and it's not just periodic publications to meet workplace PIs, performance indicators, but rather a commitment to contribute to the field and continue to develop your own understanding, because most of that for me occurs through my published work. And the quality, some of the top tier journals in the field are important, and have a minimal number of low quality publications and few short commentary pieces, and also low status publications. And there's a qualification here, which I'll come to shortly, and that is, if you as a researcher are about advocating for something, your pattern will be somewhat different than in terms of you'll be trying to engage with practitioners and bring about particular kinds of change. And also if you're in the creative fields, the aesthetic contributions are often somewhat different than through publications. Also, the quanta, the number of publications that are seen as being strong relative to opportunity. Now, recently I was sitting on a committee that was making judgments about who would become receiving awards, big national awards. And these are always very difficult decisions to make. And there's a number of highly competitive individuals that one had to be selected from. And part of that process was to say that some of the people who had long track records, a long period of service, didn't actually generate a great number of publications and also citations relative to their opportunity. So this was a deciding factor. And authorships, some on your own as a leading author with others, and co-authoring with others, a pattern of engagement which is important. And I know that in some fields, for instance, it's almost de rigueur, the accepted practice that you do not publish on your own. You have to be part of a team. But in those situations, it's helpful if you are the first named author on quite a lot of the publications. And publications, different kinds of publications, demonstrate that you can produce books. Anybody who's completed a PhD should be able to write books, contributions, chapters, and articles. And in your discipline, have some solid journals from your discipline that would be recognized within the field. So when somebody looks at your work and the basis of the field you're working in, would say that that person has been recognized and has had work accepted by their peers in the top tier journals. And citations are important. Strong citation numbers and a H index that are on an upward trajectory is very helpful. This stuff can be very readily accessed, and so people are aware of it. And this often again becomes a factor which makes decisions about securing grants, getting positions, getting rewards, etc., because it's a number. And when you're dealing with a whole range of applicants, something like numerical indicators can be quite persuasive. But why publish? There's a whole reasons of why you want to engage in this, and it's not just about those issues I've mentioned. So one is, for instance, making your scholarship accessible to others. The work that you're doing, your PhD work, is so important. It's probably one of the best pieces of work you'll do in your life. And so you want to share that. You want to make that accessible to others. And also the processes you use. You might be engaging in novel processes, interesting processes about how you've gone about gathering data and analyzing it. And I've just been talking to 3 PhD students who are all in the field of media, and they will have interesting ways in which they will engage with media and provide commentary and critique of that, which is quite different than data that might come, for instance, from interviewing people or doing work-life histories or highly quantitative evaluations of something. And what I find really helpful is that the process of writing really advances your thinking, my thinking. And it actually is the procedure which I often use to help me build explanations about things, theory building, as it were. And of course, it's very helpful for building your research profile, which can then be instrumental in you getting opportunities and being given, funding to pursue your interests, and perhaps those of the interests that you're trying to advocate for or have concerns about. And then there's pragmatic concerns about employment and, as we mentioned, improving prospects for tenure and promotion. Then there's also this important area that it allows you then to address issues and goals that are impacting upon you and your community, and that is advocating for a particular set of issues, albeit environment, gender, etc., etc. These are the driving your interests. Publications can be a way of contributing to advocating for that field, albeit through scholarly means. And then securing scholarships and grants, as I've mentioned, and also capturing the impact of your scholarship, indicating that there is impact arising from it, and enriching your working life. I mean, that's, again, for me is very important. The ability to do this kind of work. As Toby mentioned, I first started working out in the clothing industry, and an industry where you clock on and clock off and have designated meal breaks, etc. That's very different kind of work than the work I'm doing now, which I have incredible freedom to think and to act and to pursue my interests. So I feel very privileged to be able to do this kind of work compared with the kind of work I did as a young man. And also your institution likes you to publish because it's part of the profile of performance indicators for your institution. Okay. Now there's a variety of publications, and here I'm using the Australian nomenclature. I'm sure there's one in Iceland as well. And so you have authored books, that is books you write yourself, a bit like your PhD dissertation. Then you have edited books where you edit the books and people and yourself make contributions. And then there's chapters that you provide, chapters in edited books. And then there's journal articles. And then on top of that, there is also special editions of journals. So that's when a journal has a special issue on a particular topic. So the 3 PhD students I talked before, I'm sure if there was a special issue on contemporary analysis of media, those 3 students would be able to contribute to that because there's cognate interests in their work, I think. And then there's conference proceedings. When you go to a conference and your paper is accepted through a refereed process and the proceedings are published, that is also accepted as a publication. Then we're asked to do things for government, and so we prepare government reports. There are items in the popular press because some of the issues that we deal with are of interest to the general public, and that this is important. We, as appropriate, we engage with the research we do to inform the public conversation, the public discourse about things. And then there's opinion pieces where we can have an opinion and promote that. And there's particular outlets for that. One is the conversation, for instance. And there's other kinds of avenues that you can publish. One thing I do, and I've got an example behind me, but not in front of me, is that I produce these research bulletins, which are in PDF formats, and they're just either 4 or 8 sides of bits of paper. And they're printed off on nice glossy paper if I want to hand them out, distribute them. But I also found this terribly helpful during the COVID period, because although I couldn't engage with people, if people asked me about a particular project, I could simply attach a PDF which gives an overview, the findings and contributions. And that was a way of disseminating my work. But it doesn't get any points in terms of, you know, high prestigious journals. But I guess so there's different focuses for all these publications, and they're worth at any time in the research career. But initially, and perhaps across your working life, that journal articles are likely to be the most important and viable for you. And that is, you know, an issue that is different in different countries. Some countries don't even count book chapters. They only count journals, and some countries only count particular kinds of journals. And I suspect in the future that is going to increase, because there's been a massive proliferation of the number of journals out there. And some of them are there for purposes by which individuals can make payments to have their work published, etc. So quality journals is likely to be the focus, the most important focus of your work over a long period of time. But what are the implications from these types of publications? Well, firstly, what purposes are you publishing for? Is it about informing practice? Is it about conceptual development? Is about trying to address an issue that is current in the world, or whatever? So you need to think about, you know, what are you trying to do, and that will direct you towards different kinds of publications. Also, for instance, some publications only accept quantitative papers, and some accept qualitative papers. Some accept both, and then some journals will only accept reviews of literature, etc. So you need to think about what you're doing. So what kind of publications is best suited for your purpose? And being selective about your publications, because it's a very effortful process. You invest a lot of time in it. It's worthwhile thinking of where you're heading, and what kind of publications you plan and prepare for, and how you prepare for them. So be aware of style of writing, language, length, and genre. So for instance, I publish in a range of different types of journals, and I noticed once that many readers from Scandinavia were citing articles I published in a journal called the Journal of Workplace Learning. And I asked some of them about that. And what they said was that they found the style of writing in that journal far easier to engage with as being non-native English speakers. And that is, they were saying that some of the conceptual articles I've written in other journals, such as Mind, Culture and Activity, were far too difficult for them. But whereas the style of writing in the Journal of Workplace Learning is intentionally an easier style, and they found that to be interesting. Another example is a journal called Clinical Teacher, and that's intended for busy people who work in hospitals and want to know how to develop the skills of the next generation of healthcare practitioners. And there, the articles are fairly short. There's a particular style, because these are busy people and they need to access ideas and get the essence of them without without what is necessary in other kinds of publications, which is an overview of the conceptual approaches you're taking. So different styles, different language, and different genre of writing exist in these journals. And also consider what are you most likely to be successful in having your work published. For instance, there isn't much point in sending a qualitatively underpinned paper to a journal which is highly quantitative. For instance, in my field, there are about 4 journals which have the name work in them, and I do a lot of research on work. However, 3 of those journals, I think, possibly 2 now, but 3 used to be the journals of sociological associations in UK and America. And there's simply no point in me submitting articles to it, because the articles in those were inherently sociological, and I'm a cultural psychologist, and there would be nobody to review, and there wouldn't be an audience that would be interested essentially in what I was proposing. And I had sort of professional conversations with the editors of those journals, and they were sympathetic, but I understood their perspective. But the scientific and professional worth resides in the process of peer review. And in case you're not familiar with it, there's 2 forms. The first one is called blind peer review, and that is used for the review of book proposals, manuscripts, grant applications, promotion applications, grant reports. And this is done by people who are anonymous, but they know whose work they're reviewing, and they have to, because they're looking at the person's publications and what they've achieved. They have to know that person. The second form of peer review is what is referred to as double-blind review, where the work is made anonymous, and so the reviewer doesn't know who's the author of what they're reviewing, and obviously the authors don't know who is reviewing their work. And so this is the process which is used in many journals. Now, if we come to the process of what happens in a journal, most journals have at least 2 reviewers for their articles. And typically the process goes something like this, that authors prepare a manuscript for submission, and it's hoped that they look at the journal and develop a proposal which is in line with the journal's interests and focus and topics and genre, etc. And then it's submitted. And then the editors will consider it for review, and then maybe it'll go out to review, so that editors will then select reviewers, people review it, and it's assessed by reviewers. The reviews come back to the editor, they make a decision, and maybe it goes then through either reject or cycles of revisions. But let me just take the example of the journal that I edit. That requires 3 reviewers, because it's an ISI journal. So it's a CSI journal, which is a prestigious journal, and part of the requirements is you have to have 3 reviewers. It makes sense, because you can get 2 reviewers who are diverse, so a third one, you get a greater perspective. So there's a journal that I have to find 3 reviewers for each article that comes in. So people prepare submissions to the journal that I edit, and each week I get maybe 5 or 6 submissions. And then, so they come in, and then I and my co-editor separately look at them and decide whether they will go to review. Now, this might horrify you, but the rejection rate at that level is about 90%. And so the vast majority of articles that come in are called what's a des reject, and that is they don't go to review. And the reasons often are that it's simply outside of the scope of the journal, and that they're not prepared enough, they won't be of interest to the readership of the journal, and as a consequence then they're rejected. Now, one reason we have to be fairly firm about that is that our policy is that we ask our reviewers to review 1 article a year, and I need 3 reviewers. Now, it's not unusual for me to have to approach 8 people to get 3 reviews. So if I see an article which I do not think will have any prospect of being published, I cannot simply draw upon and utilize the resources of very busy academics by asking them to review articles which simply don't, on my judgment, stand a chance of being published. And by the way, I've run moderated processes with an entire editorial board, to see if the kind of decisions we make at that point are actually validated across a broad number of individuals. And generally speaking, they are. So those that go out then are, they go out to 3 reviewers, and the reviewers make comments. It's often very difficult to find reviewers. We ask our submitters to suggest some reviewers because we don't always accept them, and we don't always use all of them. We rarely use all of them, but it helps us find people who may be able to review the article. And of course, we're conscious of any, relationship between, we try to be conscious, I should say, of any relationship between the reviewers and the author. And it's assessed by the reviewers, and then we make judgments, and then make decisions, and then normally it goes through a cycle of revisions, because there's not been one article that's been submitted to the journal that's gone straight through and been accepted. Every article has gone through at least 1 iteration, or often 2 iterations of revisions before they're deemed successful. So that's that process. You might be surprised to know that as an editor, often I actually work in favor of the authors more than the reviewers. Sometimes reviewers can be extremely harsh, unreasonably so, and I then have to mediate, and it's far more likely I will mediate in favor of the author than the reviewers. And when I write a decision to the contributors, I normally would say, please consider reviewer number 1, blah, 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 2 points. And then consider the second point that reviewer number 2 makes. It's up to you to consider whether you want to address the other comments. What I'm saying is I'm guiding the responses to the reviews to achieve the outcomes. One very practical consideration from the editor's perspective is that each year I have to get a total of 24 articles published. And it's my requirement as part of the ISA that I actually have to complete the issues within a year. So we have 3 issues a year, 8 articles. So I need to approve 24 articles a year. So I have that goal as well as other goals that I need to address. So it's important then. Now, one point there is that you might want to remember that if you see a journal that has perhaps 6 issues a year, it is likely to be far more hungry than a journal that perhaps only has 3 issues a year. And I leave you to think that through and consider that. That's not to say it's going to be easy. It's just that it might be easier. It might not be, however. So the important thing is for you as a student or a PhD student or a junior academic is to be active and agentic. Put quite simply, there's a lot that you can do. You can prepare articles, book proposals. You complete book manuscripts. You can prepare proposals for edited books. Invite people to work with you. Prepare proposals for special issues. Again, you go to a conference and you're part of a symposia. Suggest then that, hey, let's make this into a special issue. So be proactive. Approach editors and request to review articles. Engage with more experienced authors. I mean, you can engage with them. They can only say no. And, let's hope most of them say yes. And particularly engage those with which you have shared interests, including, of course, your supervisors. But be selective and consider carefully the choices of your outlets, journals, and publishing houses. As I'm sure you're aware, there's a whole range of publishing houses which are seen to be dubious. Will try and secure funds from you to publish their work. And these are often seen as being, perilous publications. And the point is that if you do get publications in these journals and they sit on your CVs, people in the field are aware of their standing, and it's not necessarily going to do you any great benefit from publishing in vanity journals that you pay money to have published. Also, be careful of companies that do not market publications, because that means that your work will not be disseminated widely. There are, however, circumstances when you are dependent upon others, and this is to invitations to edited books, special editions, and handbooks. And so talk to people in the field, make contacts, seek advice, and try and publish well, because that's from where the invitations will arise. So volunteer to review, accept invitations to review. That can be helpful. You can learn an awful lot about the quality of manuscripts, because when you review for the journal I edit, when a decision's made, you see not only your comments, but you see the comments made by the other reviewers, and you can get an understanding then of what your peers are saying about the quality of work. The important point here is there's a lot you can do, so don't wait around for something to happen, and you're not dependent on others. I mean, I'm not fond of cartoons or anything like that, but there's one cartoon that I always remember, and that is it's about vultures. And as you know, vultures prey upon dead things. And the cartoon is of two vultures sitting on the branch of a tree, and one says to the other, "Patience, my ass, let's go and kill something." So the point is, be active, be, agentic, get out there, and don't wait for people to invite you. The stuff that you can do. So there's a whole pile of sources for your writing. Some people say, well, I don't have a grant at the moment, therefore I can't publish anything. There's a whole pile of stuff you can do. Your master's or your doctoral dissertation provides the basis for a lot of publications, and you should be publishing from every part of your master's and your PhD dissertation. Every bit of it provides publications. I think my last publication for my PhD was 8 years after it was completed. And there's reviews of literature. One of my most cited articles was a review of literature comparing cognitive and sociocultural constructivist views on what constitutes learning. You can do that. You can actually, review the literature, and that should be part, for instance, of your doctoral work. You can actually reflect on research methods and procedures. Currently, I'm engaged with a colleague writing papers on how we can quantify qualitative data in ways which is valid, but allows us to see patterns within quantitative data that we wouldn't otherwise be able to secure. So that's talking about method. I've written papers on the life history method, for instance, how you go about gathering data, also through the use of critical incidents as a means by which you can gather data and undertake its analysis. There's also reviews of others' work, and that, by the way, can include your students. I remember realizing that many of my students I was teaching, undergraduate students, were struggling with the concept of curriculum. And so I wrote papers on what constitutes curriculum, different dimensions of it, the intended, the enacted, and the experienced. And more recently, I've been writing papers on the personal curriculum, which is the trajectory which individuals take across their life course. Now, all of this comes from a critique of people viewing curriculum as being a document, and a document advanced normally by religious or states. But curriculum is far more than that. And then there's gathering data, which only takes time to review, doesn't cost much. So currently I do interviews on people's work-life history. And I've currently, just yesterday, I undertook an interview of somebody here in Finland, and I'll be doing more this week, on what constitutes wisdom in practice, asking them about how they became effective in their practice and what led to that effectiveness. And this just takes an hour of your time to find people, to take an hour of your time to do the interview, and then more time to interview, to analyze the interview data. But this is stuff you can do that doesn't require labs or excessive infrastructure. It can be done within your own resources. And so responding to concerns, annoyances, public discussions, or misunderstandings. So I've written about how the term informal learning is a nonsense, and it's used regularly, and it's been adopted by the OECD, which makes it very difficult to take out of the public discourse. But also you see concepts like lifelong learning, when in actual fact, most of the references are about the provision of experiences, which is lifelong education. So it allows you to engage with these ideas and seek conceptual or procedural clarity around them. So the point here is that that there's often data that you can actually access. There's a mistake in this slide here that I understood from the OECD that what's called the program of the International Assessment of Adult Competence was being undertaken in Iceland, and that's a great source of data. However, we found out just late last week that in fact Iceland didn't sign up to actually undertake that, although it's on the OECD website. Now that, by the way, is a body of data that has been gathered in 35 countries and is publicly available. And it's a whole range of measures. Most countries have had 4,000 respondents, and they provide very detailed interviews about a whole range of factors about adults' learning and development. And it's available, and you can do a whole pile of analyses with it. So there's a whole pile of sources for your writing. It's just not premised upon the funded research project you have or you wished you had. Now, the writing process, this is just personal preference. So everybody has their own approach to it. Here, there's just some ideas about trying to start early, come up with an idea, something will annoy you, write an abstract, trying in the abstract to write what it's about, and then develop that into an article. And you don't have to use citations and abstracts, and keep your language and structure simple. I have a habit of using headings to be descriptive. I don't like using introduction, rather, and I tell my doctoral students this, what are you introducing? So rather than having a bland title like introduction, say, what is the concept you're introducing? Rather than literature review, what are you reviewing? And then rather than methods, what's the description of your methods? And rather than findings, make a statement about the findings. Now, some journals don't like that. In fact, lots of people don't like it. They say, why don't you use standard headings? Well, they're pretty boring, but more than that, they're unhelpful, because a heading should help assist understand the text that's sitting below it. And so you coming up with a short statement actually presses you into saying, what exactly am I trying to state here? And that's why I like descriptive headings. Use short and interesting titles for papers, not overly long ones. And it's interesting, if you look across, you'll find that some of the best journals actually have very short titles. Certainly in my field, there's journals such as Mind, Culture and Activity. There is Learning and Instruction. The journal I founded is called Vocations and Learning. So it's very clear statements about what the journal is about, and follow that and model that in your titles. Anyway, but whatever you do, just get into it and write, and get into the practice of writing. Have manuscripts in various draft forms. Now, one thing you need to be alerted to is that publication practices are currently changing. There are now fewer publication houses. You might think there's different companies, Taylor and Francis, Routledge, etc., but you'll find that they're all owned by one company. And Palgrave, yeah, but now Springer owns them. So they use similar processes, and that's increasing sales and production of electronic texts, and hard copies are now becoming a rarity. In the journal I edit, they no longer produce hard copies. In the book series that I edit, the only hard copies are the ones that are sent, the complimentary ones sent to the authors, and the ones they use for display purposes. All the rest are electronic. You can purchase them, don't get me wrong, but it's the exception. Importantly, it's essentially the rise of PDFs, that whether you're producing a journal article, a book chapters, all of these then fall into a pattern of being PDFs. Now, about 2015, I sent a manuscript off to Springer, who I published with a lot, and I had, it was a short book. I had 5 chapters and then a consolidated reference list at the end of it. When it came back, it had 5 separate chapters, and the references were with each of the chapters. And that is because they'd changed to have selling each of the chapters as a separate PDF. Now, that's got a couple of implications. Firstly, that when you're producing a book, or more than one, a book, for instance, you cannot assume, and do not assume, that the person will start at chapter 1 and read through. you have to make each chapter stand alone. And the download figures are very clear that, generally speaking, that it's the first 2 chapters of books that get the downloads, the ones that give the overview of everything to save somebody reading 12 chapters or whatever. They're the ones that get the downloads, unless you've got some luminary on chapter 5 that attracts it. But generally speaking, so what I do now with my edited books is I don't have at the end a summary chapter. I bring the summary chapter to be number 2. The first one introduces the whatever's going to be in the book, and the second chapter then is the summarizing of the contributions of the book, because the practices of reading and engaging with text have changed. So there's electronic platforms for editing work, and also the publishers have the ability now to scan manuscripts to identify if the content has been published elsewhere. The downloads of chapters can be very easily monitored, so you can get indications then of how many people download your chapters, and don't keep on downloading your own chapters, because that can be detected as well. And that's so the point here, as I've just made, is that chapters need to be standalone. You can't rely on the fact that the person has read the preceding chapters. It has to be a standalone. And so this influences, as I've said, how books are structured and chapters are written in the contemporary era. So here's just some rough hints that writing clear and plain English, use the easiest, most commonly understood word that captures your meaning. Do not try and impress with vocabulary. Yes, we've all got thesauruses on our computers, and we can come up with words which are not commonly used, and it doesn't impress. What impresses is clear presentation of ideas. In foreshadowing the case, in most sections, it should be saying up front what the particular section's about, not expecting the reader to want to make sense of that, guide the reader through it, and avoid a repetitive structure, but also say up front what you're arguing. Who killed the cook? You don't want to wait until the last page to find out the key conclusions of the article or the book. We want to know straight up front that the cook was killed by the butler's jealous uncle because he didn't like the cook or something like that. You say that up front, and so after that, the reader is guided in knowing where they're heading. So make your conclusions explicit in the abstract and in the introduction. Say what you're arguing. And languages editing is helpful for everybody. I actually get my papers edited, and one reason is I use voice-activated software to write these days, and I can introduce errors that I can't see because the text comes out spelt correctly, but I might miss words out. I might want to say unlikely, and likely will come out, or unambitious, and ambitious will come out. So I need somebody to go through and pick up those kind of errors. And make sure that the case flows across the sections. One thing I learned early was it's very helpful to read out aloud the text you're writing, because that gives you an indication of flow. I notice in Iceland that you have cattle grids, that is, grids across the road to stop cattle, I presume, or sheep perhaps, coming onto the roads. In New Zealand, they're called judabars. And it's a nice analogy, because when you read things aloud, you find out when you hit a judabar, when there isn't continuity in your argument, when what you say just finishes and then the next thing starts and there's no link between them. So by reading it out aloud, you help get a sense of how somebody else will read your work. And citations, here's these issues. Don't over or undercite, and that's a judgment. Use citations previously used and be familiar with the readership of the journal. Do not use multiple sources unless you're making a very specific point, a more general point, and that the references should be credible and accessible. And the final thing there is revising your work. Keep on doing that. Revision is next to godliness, so that your readers will not become, or your reviewers, I beg your pardon, will not become your copy editors. Because if your reviewers start copy editing, you've lost it. You've lost them engaging with the text. Now, just I think to finish up really, is that we have this problem for countries that sit outside of those that are the principal hosts of many of these journals, and that's obviously the United Kingdom and America, and to some degree some of the European countries. And what you find there's a bad habits of British, European, and American centrism, where it's expected that the rest of the world will understand and know and prefer the kind of ideas that come from those countries. And yet, often we cannot get away with it, the countries on the periphery. I've had that across my working career with presenting stuff from Australia, but in the last 3 or 4 years, I've been working with colleagues in Singapore and publishing through them. And some of the comments that have come through in the reviews of our articles are quite ridiculous. Some of them are saying, oh, why would anybody interested in something which is coming from Singapore? Yet we have to be inherently interested in stuff that's coming from Britain or America or some of the European countries. It's also quite culturally offensive. One of my colleagues once said, it seems as though they don't want to hear the voice of Asia. And so I've experienced in the last couple of years this sort of a cultural bias in particular with working with Singaporean colleagues, but it's something which occurs for the work I've done. And I know my colleagues in other countries which are on the periphery report the same thing. And it wouldn't surprise me if colleagues from Iceland encounter the same kind of resistance. So one of the advice I give people is, rather than to make the conceptual point, that is, if you're doing something, for instance, on multiculturalism, or you're doing something on older workers, or you're doing something on learning through work or innovation work, which is the thing I do, you make that the focus, and then you say the study is undertaken. This is a case study from Singapore, Australia, New Zealand, Iceland. So you make the case, and this is a case study, and you make the conceptual point as being important, rather than thrusting first the country of origin. Now this is just being quite pragmatic, but it seems to be necessary. And it's difficult to change cultural practices and cultural biases, as I'm sure you're all aware. So my emphasis there, my advice there is really about, for instance, I've just last week, I beg your pardon, I had a new book published, and it's about continuing education and training. The title, I think, is Continuing Education and Training, Purposes, Practices and Policies. However, all of the content of the empirical work within that book comes from a large study I did in Singapore. Yet I know that if I put Singapore in the title of the book, it won't be as engaged as well as it does within, if I didn't have that. And what I've done in the book is actually refer to the general literature and then take cases from the data from Singapore. And I've made a case within that book about why the readership should be interested in the kind of practices from Singapore, simply because they've had structured processes of continuing education and training for 40 years. But more than that, as a country dependent upon its human resources, continuing education and training is vital for them. The other thing is that to help you expand and extend your reading to a broader audience, I used to tell people, imagine somebody pulling your book off the book shelf in a library in Little Rock, Arkansas in 8 years' time. I might have been saying that when Clinton was in power in America. But the idea is that you need to be aware that somebody in the future will be reading your work, and that in another cultural context. And so make it accessible. Don't be too parochial. Don't be so specific as it isn't amenable to another readership. So I'd say, for instance, consider your reader sitting in Dordrecht, which is the town in Germany, in Netherlands, which Springer is based in. And if you sit on the waterfront there, you look across the Atlantic to America. To the south, there is, obviously countries such as Spain and Portugal, and then to the east there is Germany and the countries going to the east, and then to the north there is the Scandinavian countries. Imagine what your readers will, and how they will engage with your work from those perspectives. And because we're on the periphery, we have to be a little bit cleverer. We have to be better. We have to be adroit with our conceptualizations. We have to be a little bit better than some of those that are on this from the center. So we need to pedal harder. If it's easy to do, it's probably not worthwhile, but engage with your colleagues and collaborate with your supervisors. So that's, I think, is about it from me. And I've talked far too long. It's supposed to be a dialogue, but perhaps Toby has a few questions that I can respond to.
Let me just unmute. Thank you so much, Professor Billett, for this incredible wisdom you've given us. And unfortunately, because this is not a live event, there aren't there won't be any questions from the audience. But I did think of some that PhD students, for instance, who I serve, would be interested in asking. And one is so many, but right. Well, just to go back to the beginning, you're talking about the centrality of publications. You had that one slide when you laid out everything very nicely. And then you talked about the first step. Oh, yes, it'd be great if we could go back to it. Yes, that one. Thank you so much. And there you talked about, I was very interested in a few words that might be especially relevant for early career researchers. On the top right corner there, upper right corner, potential for research and publication. And this brings up the question of how many publications, in today's world, PhD students need to be competitive for that postdoc or for, an assistant professorship.
Yeah, I mean, it's very difficult to give you numbers. It varies from country to country. It varies from discipline to discipline. I think it just goes back to demonstrating the qualities that were mentioned in the following slide, which is about coherence, which is about indicating that you've got publications in progress. You've got, and you can do that, by the way, on an application. You can indicate, you've got ones in preparation and have been submitted for review. I think it's about demonstrating this potential, because when a university is seeking to employ somebody, or a highly competitive scheme such as postdocs, there is really a need to make a judgment about, will this person perform at a high level if we offer them a job, or if they get this scholarship, will they actually come up with the goods? So anything you can do to demonstrate that you have that potential, refer to people you're engaging with, publication plans, indicator, I have a publication plan that that indicates the sequence of publications I've got, and it has different stages, where it's at, where's what's from the review. Indicate that you've got a plan, you've published from your PhD, and if you haven't published everything yet, where will you be publishing it and when that will happen? Because essentially it's and increasingly positions are becoming more and more competitive to get jobs, but also the postdocs are becoming highly competitive. And one of the great things about the processes which are used in Northern Europe and Scandinavia is that PhDs often comprise of a number of publications. Whereas, for instance, the students in Australia, generally speaking, do an entire monograph. And then once they've completed it, essentially 3 people read it, and then it has to be torn apart and then sent off as individual publications. So the practice you have here, I think, is a really helpful one for junior researchers, because you go into the field already with publications, and you've had the experience of submitting your own work for peer reviews, etc. And of course, that then allows you to provide quotes from the, if they're positive, from the reviewers about the quality of the work, etc. So anything you can do then to demonstrate that your potential, I think is very important.
Thank you for that, clearing that up. And another question regarding this slide too, which is, of course, the red thread through the slide was publications, but another word that pops up a bit, at least twice, is teaching. So I was wondering if you can maybe give us our early career researchers some tools for thinking about what seems to be an apparent contradiction in academia, that teaching is required and is important, but also seen as not important, and how to weigh up this kind of dissonance about teaching and versus publications.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I think the great risk, of course, is that universities now are offering teaching only positions. And if you don't have a strong profile, they'll say, okay, we can offer you a job. However, it is 70% teaching, 10% service, and 20% research. And that really means 100% teaching, because the teaching load will be excessive. What I think that's why I think having the strong profile, having a plan, means that if you're offered a position, you can negotiate for it to be a balanced program of, research, teaching, and service, if that's the model here. But you see, and that's then again another reason for having a strong profile, because it will position you well in terms of how you're seen. Because if you're seen as being a potential person who ultimately will bring in grants, etc., they will want you on a more stronger research workload. The other thing is that, if at all possible, what you should be teaching is what you're researching, because it's such an important process. Because it's so important we take our research into our teaching to inform our students about our teaching should be informed by our researching. It's fundamental to it, but also in actually teaching it often helps us think more clearly about our work and our ideas, our conceptions. And I've given a couple of examples of where, when I've had to teach things, I've realized that there's a contradiction in my thinking, in concepts that are popularly used out there, and that has then driven me to focus on those as part of my scholarly work. So wherever possible, and when you have alignment between your teaching and research, all of a sudden some of the barriers that a heavy teaching load generates tend to be softened a bit, because there's an interplay between the two. And I know it's not always possible, but if at all possible, if you can negotiate teaching on areas in which you have expertise, which makes absolute perfect sense, that can be helpful. I mean, of course, part of teaching, and it does differ from institution to institution, is actually research supervision. And so if junior staff or students can, approach experienced supervisors and say, can you please take me on as an associate supervisor, so they get used to that experience, that can also help, because that then leads into you being able to supervise masters and doctoral dissertations. And again, don't wait for people to come and knock on your door, because they might not. Feel free to, I mean, people can only say no, not the end of the world. So you can approach people and say, look, if at all possible, if any opportunities come up, could you please consider me to be, I'm quite happy to, play whatever role you'd like, but I'd like to be an associate supervisor. So teacher, but I mean, that depends, because some universities have teaching, doctoral supervision, or HRD supervision as part of the research load, but others have it as part of the teaching load. It just depends how it's configured in the particular university. But in all of these things, showing willingness and showing agency, but again, a lot of it is based upon the outcomes which are most measurable, which is the publications. Anybody can quickly look at the number of publications, their frequency, and 2 seconds, you hop onto Google Scholar and you can look at somebody's profile. And if the person doesn't have the profile, that raises questions. But also when you're applying for grants or promotions, if you aren't able to, excuse me, actually indicate these days what your citations are, the assumption is you don't have them or it's very low. So in some sense, it's better to actually declare them and say that these are quite nascent because you're generating a profile, because their absence often leads to suspicion that you've got nothing to show in that field.
Mm-hmm.
And that again is simply because of the competitive nature we're in. When I'm reviewing applications, and I can review 100 grant applications, up to 100 grant applications when I'm working for the Australian Research Council, and those applications are often 150 pages long, and people make claims, pages and pages about their standing in the world, blah, blah, blah. And then you compare what they're stating in terms of them being a world authority on X, Y, and Z with the number of citations, and you quickly come to conclusions about whether what is being proposed is substantive or is it just fanciful. Yeah. So, and I know it's not easy to get it, and it takes time to get citations, but unfortunately it's when in competitive fields, it's something which is used.
Just maybe 2 quick questions to wrap things up that concern writing, and that was a theme sort of towards the end of your presentation. You gave some very valuable advice about writing. One is, what would be, for PhD students, what would be your number 1 tip for increased writing productivity?
Yeah, I mean, I think find the time that you can best do that. For me, it's often mornings, but then my daughter's grown up, so I don't have family responsibilities first thing in the morning for getting, kids off to school or whatever. So I've got choice in that, but I think it's important for people to try and block out time. For me, the mornings, I'm fresher. And also when you're going for a walk or weeding the garden or whatever, if an idea comes up, go and write it down, and then start playing around with it, adding text to it and thinking about it. And by the way, I do encourage particularly anybody who hasn't learned to touch type to actually use what I use, which is voice activated software. I can generate text at a very high rate through my voice. And one of the reasons I do that is that I didn't learn to type, and I now have repetitive strain injury in my right hand because I never learned to type. And so these 3 fingers here did everything. And then one day they didn't. But for instance, I find that learning to use voice activated software has been incredibly productive for me. One reason is that you had to learn to speak in sentences. And that then means you have to structure your ideas within the structure of a sentence, which is normally a proposition and qualifying clauses. And that helps your thinking process. So some people have been kind enough to comment that when I give keynotes and presentations, they're very clear because I speak in sentences, full stop, which is what I do when I'm writing, comma. So I would encourage people to explore that technology. It's very good technology. And for me, at home, I stand up. I don't have to touch the computer. I speak into the computer and I can generate text at a very high rate and then go through and edit it back. And that's a way of getting a lot of text down very quickly. As somebody who've never learned to touch type and now can't, because if I learn to touch type, I will simply incite an injury in my right hand. So that kind of technology, I think, has been enormously helpful for me and has helped my productivity enormously. Yeah.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. Great advice about voice activated software. One last question, which has to do with writing and technology. And you talked about how the publishing landscape is changing. And of course, one reason it is because of large language models, artificial intelligence. So do you have some advice for our young researchers about particularly those who might not have English as a first language, about how to use AI writing aids without it leading to, their enfeeblement. There's often talk about the danger of ChatGPT and other things is that it might enfeeble our writing capacity. So how does one maintain that balancing act?
Yeah, I mean, I think a couple of responses. Firstly, I think it's evolving so quickly, it's very difficult to give definitive answers. Excuse me. I mean, one problem I have as an editor, for instance, is that I don't know the text that's coming in, how it's been generated. A couple of examples is that recently I received an abstract for a special issue. The first sentence was, it was from China, and it said that apprenticeship is a key part of higher vocational education in China, full stop. Now, having visited China and those institutions, I know that apprenticeship isn't a part of higher vocational education. It's like 300 students sitting in a lecture theatre. So I wrote back, and it was beautifully written, by the way. This abstract was beautifully written, but it was nonsense. And I wrote back, and I never heard back from the person I queried this with. And then another paper came in, and it had, from China, but it had all the European, Scandinavian authors that I would cite. And as I was reading it through, I saw there's something very familiar about this, and I realized it was my voice. And so presumably it had been told to write a manuscript using the voice of Stephen Billett, because I have so many publications out there. Now, the point in both those instances that if somebody else had reviewed that abstract or read that manuscript, they wouldn't have picked that up. So it's causing enormous problems for people like myself who have to make decisions about manuscript. I don't have the slightest problem because I'm enormously privileged by being an English speaker, and I'm very conscious of that. We get away with murder compared with colleagues from other linguistic groups that have to learn English to publish in often the most prestigious journals. I actually don't have a problem with people using whatever sources they can to improve their language, as long as they learn through it, so that their language, English language, is improved. So if artificial intelligence can be used to assist the clarity of language, I don't personally object to that. What I worry about, though, is that artificial intelligence is actually generative. It actually generates stuff. For instance, we've tried putting interview transcripts through artificial intelligence and asking it to do an analysis, and it has come up with direct quotes that are illustrative. But when we search the transcripts, we cannot find those direct quotes. So it's making stuff up, which is what it's supposed to do. It's generative. And that's where the risk comes in. So as a tool to assist language cleaning, just like we've had for years, spell checks and things in word processing packages, I don't have a problem with that. I think over time, people begin to use it for doing searches. But what there has to be, obviously, is checks upon the validity and the quality of what it is generating. And is it really saying, is that really real, the stuff that's coming out, or is it being generated? And I guess a set of protocols will be emerging soon. I've repeatedly asked Springer, the publisher I work with in the journal and the book series, what advice they have on how we manage it. And they have yet to come back with a convincing response, because it's new to everybody and we're still trying to grapple with it. I think it's like lots of things. You don't overeat, you don't overdrink, you don't oversmoke or whatever. Perhaps don't smoke at all. But you just need to treat it with caution, be critical about its use, as with, if you're doing any kind of analysis using software for either qualitative or quantitative analysis, you need to be aware of its limitations. And I think that is exercised within the use of AI. But having said that, I think it's very much an evolving circumstance, and I think we're all trying to learn how to use it. So I think caution, engagement if necessary, but do so cautiously.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, thank you so much, Professor Billett, for giving us so much of your time, so much of your expertise. I know this will be very useful for early career researchers, and I wish you good luck with your talk tomorrow. Hope you get some great feedback, and please enjoy the rest of your stay here in Iceland.
And thanks very much for the invitation. It's great to have the opportunity to engage with you, your colleagues, and your students. Thank you very much.
Thank you.